She looked like just another quiet, elderly woman flying alone in first class, polite, soft-spoken, barely noticeable. When she asked for a simple glass of water, the flight attendant smirked, insulted her, and then did something unthinkable. She slapped the cup right out of her hand, soaking her blouse in front of everyone. The passengers said nothing. The crew looked away. But what no one realized was that the man sitting silently behind her was not just any traveler. He was her son, and the billionaire who owned the systems keeping that airline in business. And the moment he stood up, everything changed. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this kind of story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. Margaret stepped into the cabin slowly, her hands gently clutching the thin strap of her brown leather purse. Her silver hair was tied neatly at the back, and her pale blue blouse was carefully ironed. She walked with grace, her back straight despite her age. The passengers in first class barely looked up. Most were busy with their phones or adjusting their seats. Margaret gave a warm smile to the flight attendant at the door and said, "Thank you, dear," in a soft voice before making her way to seat 1A. She sat down gently, took a deep breath, and looked out the window. Her movements were quiet and respectful, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone around her. She adjusted the seatbelt and placed her purse on her lap. The plane was still boarding. She could hear voices from the back, laughter, and overhead compartments being opened and shut. She folded her hands over her purse and waited patiently. In seat 1B, right behind her, sat a man wearing a charcoal gray sweater, dark jeans, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones. His name was Brandon Walker. He looked calm, lost in thought, scrolling slowly through something on his tablet. He kept to himself, as usual. Most people didn't recognize him without a suit or bodyguards. But Brandon was one of the most powerful tech investors in the world. Quiet, private, and extremely rich. No one on that plane knew Margaret was his mother, not even the flight attendants. A few minutes later, Margaret pressed the small button on the side of her seat. She didn't want much, just a glass of water before takeoff. Her mouth felt dry, and she hadn't eaten since early morning. After a short delay, a flight attendant named Cassandra appeared. She had blonde hair tied in a bun and a perfect uniform that looked freshly pressed. Her face was tight, her smile forced. "Yes?" Cassandra asked, sounding more annoyed than helpful. Margaret gave a soft smile. "Would it be possible to have a glass of water, please?" Cassandra blinked, looked her up and down quickly and said, "We haven't even taken off yet. You'll have to wait." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away briskly. Margaret sat quietly, not saying a word. She didn't complain. She just looked down at her hands and waited. But a few minutes later, she noticed Cassandra coming down the aisle again, this time smiling at another passenger, laughing softly, handing out champagne and snacks. When she reached Margaret's row, she skipped her again. No eye contact, nothing. Margaret pressed the call button once more. Cassandra stopped and turned, her smile fading fast. "I told you already," Cassandra said sharply. "You need to wait like everyone else." "I'm sorry," Margaret said, her voice low. "I just haven't had anything to drink today, that's all." Cassandra narrowed her eyes. "You act like you've never flown first class before." Several passengers nearby turned their heads slightly. Some paused their conversations. One man put down his newspaper. Margaret said nothing. She lowered her eyes and gave a slow nod. Without another word, Cassandra placed a small, half-filled cup of water on Margaret's tray table. But the cup tilted. Water spilled across the table and onto Margaret's lap. Margaret gasped quietly and reached for a napkin, her hands trembling. She tried to clean herself quickly, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Then, without warning, Cassandra reached down and smacked the cup off the tray. It flew to the floor and rolled under the seat. That was when Brandon took off his headphones. He stood up slowly, turning toward the aisle. His voice was calm but carried weight. "Did you just slap my mother's drink out of her hand?" he asked. Everyone around them froze. The sound of whispers stopped. Cassandra's face went pale. Margaret didn't turn around. She just sat there, trying to hold back the sting in her eyes. Brandon's eyes didn't leave Cassandra's. His voice stayed level, but his body had gone completely still. And in that moment, the entire flight changed. Cassandra took a step back. Her eyes flicked from Brandon's face to Margaret's lap, where water still dripped from the edge of her blouse. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out at first. The other passengers were still. Some leaned slightly in their seats, trying to hear. A woman across the aisle covered her mouth. A man near the front slowly removed his glasses and stared. Brandon didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "I asked you a question," he said again, slower this time. "Did you just knock my mother's drink out of her hand?" Cassandra tried to smile, but it didn't land. I didn't know she was your mother." "That's not what I asked." She shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Sir, it was an accident. There was a lot going on." "You weren't too busy to laugh and chat with that man in 2C, Brandon replied calmly. "But when she asked for water, you gave her attitude. Then you humiliated her, and now you're lying." Cassandra glanced around, her face starting to turn red. "Sir, I didn't mean—" "You meant everything you did," Brandon interrupted, still calm. "You assumed she didn't belong. You thought no one would say anything because she's quiet, because she's older, because of the way she looks." Margaret still hadn't turned around. Her eyes were focused on the window. Her hands gripped the edge of her purse. Cassandra stepped back again, trying to regain control. "If there's been a misunderstanding, I'm happy to move her to another seat." Brandon's expression didn't change. "She's not moving." "Then I'll get her a fresh drink," Cassandra added quickly. "I'll fix this." Brandon shook his head slowly. "You already broke it." He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up in his hand as he typed a short message. Then he put it back in his pocket without saying another word. Cassandra stood frozen for a second longer, then turned and walked quickly toward the galley. As she disappeared behind the curtain, the other passengers looked around at each other, nervous, wide-eyed, whispering. The air in first class had shifted completely. Brandon sat down again and leaned forward slightly, placing a gentle hand on his mother's shoulder. Margaret turned her head just enough to glance at him. Her lips didn't move, but the pain in her eyes said everything. Brandon gave a small nod. His voice dropped to a whisper only she could hear. "It's okay, Mom. I'm handling it." And he was. The call he just made was already reaching someone who could shut down the entire airline before the plane even landed. In the front of the plane, behind the closed cockpit door, a quiet buzz broke the stillness. The in-flight phone lit up with an urgent call from ground operations. The co-pilot picked it up, his brow furrowed as he listened. A few seconds later, he turned to the captain with a stiff expression. "That was corporate," he said quietly. "Mr. Walker is on board, first class. There's been an incident with his mother." The captain blinked. "Brandon Walker?" The co-pilot nodded. "Yes. He's already contacted the executive office. They want a report immediately." The captain didn't ask questions. He'd been flying for over 25 years and knew exactly what that name meant. Brandon Walker wasn't just wealthy. He was powerful in a way most people couldn't understand. If he wanted, he could pull every sponsor, partnership, and investor out of the airline by sunset. And if the report was true, that a flight attendant had mistreated his mother, this was about to become something much bigger than a passenger complaint. Back in the cabin, Cassandra stood alone in the galley, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the edge of the metal counter. She could hear murmurs from the cabin. She knew people were talking, watching, judging. Her stomach twisted with panic, but her pride kept her from showing it. She had worked for this airline for nearly 8 years. She had seen entitled passengers, fake upgrades, even verbal abuse. But this was something else. Another flight attendant, a younger woman named Brooke, stepped into the galley. She looked at Cassandra cautiously. "What happened out there?" Brooke asked in a low voice. Cassandra grabbed a paper towel and wiped her hands, pretending to be calm. She kept pushing the call button. I told her to wait, and she kept complaining. Then her son jumped in like I was attacking her. Brooke raised an eyebrow. You mean the guy in 1B? Cassandra nodded. Apparently he's some big deal. Brooke hesitated. That's Brandon Walker. His company owns half of the Wi-Fi system we use. He's the reason this airline even got new planes last year. Cassandra's throat went dry. You didn't know? Brooke asked. I didn't recognize him, Cassandra admitted, her voice quieter now. Brooke crossed her arms. You didn't have to know who he was. You just had to treat her like a person. Cassandra didn't respond. Then the in-flight phone rang again. Cassandra jumped slightly at the sound. Brooke picked it up, listened, and handed it over. It's the captain. He wants to speak to you. Cassandra pressed the receiver to her ear, her face pale. Yes, Captain? There was a pause. Then a firm, controlled voice spoke through the line. You are to remain in the galley until further notice. When we land, you'll be escorted from the aircraft by security. Do not approach the passenger in 1A again. The line went dead. Cassandra lowered the phone slowly. Her hand trembled as she placed it back on the hook. Her breathing quickened. She looked at Brooke, who was now staring at her with something close to disappointment. In seat 1A, Margaret didn't know what was happening behind the curtain, but she could feel something had shifted. The atmosphere was different, quieter, heavier, and beside her, Brandon sat still, his face calm, but his jaw tight. The first domino had already fallen, and the rest were about to follow. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, trying to dry the front of her blouse with a napkin. The cold dampness clung to her skin, but she said nothing. Her hands moved gently, quietly. She could feel the eyes of the cabin still glancing her way now and then, but no one said a word. No one had said a word when Cassandra insulted her either. Brandon hadn't touched his tablet again. He sat upright now, no longer the quiet, low-profile traveler he'd been when he boarded. His hands were folded in front of him, resting on the tray table. He didn't speak, but every movement, every breath, was deliberate, calculated. He was waiting. A few rows behind them, an older man in a business suit leaned toward his wife and whispered something. She shook her head, eyes wide. The whisper spread down the aisle. Someone had filed a complaint, a serious one. And the man in 1B. Someone said he owned several companies. Another said he had connections to the airline board. Everyone had a version, but none of them were sure. What they did know was something serious had happened. Back in the galley, Cassandra's fingers tapped nervously against the metal counter. Her mind raced with excuses, things she could say to explain the situation. Maybe she could say Margaret had been aggressive, or that the water spill was an accident. But deep down, she knew none of it would matter now. That calm voice on the phone had sealed it. She was no longer in control of this flight. Not in the air, and definitely not on the ground. The curtain shifted. Brooke re-entered the galley quietly, holding a folded sheet of paper. They're faxing this to the gate team, she said, placing it down. It's a formal incident report. You're listed in it. Cassandra didn't move. Brooke watched her for a moment before speaking again. Why didn't you just give her the water? I didn't think she belonged up here, Cassandra answered before she could stop herself. Her voice sounded small now. Brooke blinked. Because of how she looked? Cassandra didn't reply. She looked down at the floor, suddenly aware of how loud the silence had become. Meanwhile, up in the first-class cabin, a young man in 2A leaned over toward Brandon and cleared his throat. Excuse me. I saw what happened earlier. That wasn't right. If there's anything I can do. Brandon turned his head slightly. His voice was calm but cold. You saw it, and you did nothing. The man swallowed hard and leaned back into his seat. Margaret reached out and gently touched her son's wrist. Let it go, she whispered. Brandon looked at her, and for a moment his eyes softened. You shouldn't have to ask me that, he said. Not after the way she treated you. I've lived long enough to know when people show who they really are, Margaret replied. What matters is what happens after. Brandon gave her a small nod, but the tension in his jaw remained. He knew this wasn't over, and he wasn't finished yet. The hum of the engines filled the silence in first class. Passengers tried to return to their magazines, movies, or tablets, but the weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. The moment wasn't forgotten. It was still unfolding, quietly and dangerously, like a storm moving beneath the surface. Margaret sat with her hands neatly folded, her wet blouse beginning to dry. She didn't speak again. Her son had already spoken enough, and she knew him well. When Brandon went quiet, it meant things were already moving behind the scenes. He never needed to raise his voice to shake the ground under someone's feet. In the cockpit, the captain's headset crackled again with another call from ground control. This time, the voice was firmer. "Be advised," the ground operator said. "Mr. Walker's office has filed a legal report. Video footage has already been pulled from cabin surveillance. Do not allow the crew member involved to deplane until security arrives." The captain acknowledged with a short nod, even though no one could see him. He turned to the co-pilot. "We've got company waiting when we land." The co-pilot gave a low whistle and shook his head. "All that over a drink?" The captain narrowed his eyes. It was never about the drink. In the back galley, Cassandra sank into the fold-down crew seat, her legs heavy. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She hadn't heard the latest transmission, but she didn't need to. She could feel it in her gut. The kind of trouble you don't walk away from with just a warning. Brooke stood across from her, silent, arms crossed. She didn't look angry, just tired, like someone who had seen this kind of thing before. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Cassandra mumbled, barely above a whisper. Brooke didn't answer. "I just thought she was, I don't know, trying to get free stuff, or taking someone else's seat." Brooke finally spoke. "You didn't think she belonged. You made that choice before you even asked for her name." Cassandra looked up. "Are you saying you've never judged someone?" "I'm saying I've never slapped a drink out of someone's hand," Brooke replied. The tension grew quiet again. Cassandra leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. Back in seat 1A, Margaret took a small breath and closed her eyes as well. She was tired, not from the flight, but from the years of carrying herself through situations like this. Quiet disrespect, hidden shame, pretending not to notice when people looked through her instead of at her. Brandon looked around the cabin. No one would meet his eyes. The same people who watched his mother get mistreated now stared hard at their phones, the floor, their untouched meals. Not one of them had said a word. Not one. He picked up his phone again and typed a short message. "Prepare the legal response. I want full documentation before landing. No press. No soft statements." He hit send. Margaret peeked at him and gave him a quiet look. The same one she used to give when he was a boy who held grudges too tightly. But this wasn't a grudge. This was accountability. The plane cut through the sky smoothly, but inside the cabin, the air felt tense and still. Time seemed slower than usual. No one spoke loudly. Even the usual clinks of drink service and quiet laughter between first-class travelers had faded. Everyone seemed to sense that something had gone terribly wrong, and that it wasn't over. Brandon remained seated, his back straight, eyes focused on nothing in particular. His phone lay untouched on the tray table now, screen dark, but wheels were turning in his mind. This wasn't the first time he'd seen his mother disrespected. It wasn't even the worst. But it was the first time it had happened like this, in front of an audience, in a place where she had every right to feel safe and respected. And for once, there was no misunderstanding, no room for excuses. Everyone saw what happened. Everyone heard Cassandra's voice. Everyone saw the cup fall. Everyone saw the silence that followed. He looked at his mother again. She hadn't moved much. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, her head tilted slightly, resting against the window. Her eyes were open, but distant. He hated that look. The one where she disappeared inside herself, too polite to react, too proud to let them see the pain. She was a woman who had lived through worse. He knew that, but that didn't make it easier to watch. Several rows back, a man in a blazer whispered something to the passenger next to him. That was his mom. Did you see how she looked at her? Yeah, the other one murmured. It was messed up. You think the airline's going to cover for the flight attendant? I doubt it. That guy's loaded. He owns two of the biggest infrastructure firms in tech. The airline probably kisses his shoes when he walks into a meeting. The whispers weren't loud, but they reached enough ears. A woman sitting across the aisle from Brandon leaned forward slightly and cleared her throat. Mr. Walker, I just want to say, I'm sorry for what happened. It was wrong. I should have said something. Brandon didn't turn his head. But you didn't, he said, his voice low. She sat back quietly. Across the curtain, Cassandra sat with her elbows on her knees, face in her hands. Her lipstick had faded, and her hair had loosened from its once perfect bun. Her shoulders drooped. She had never felt this powerless in all her years of working on flights. Not when dealing with drunk passengers. Not during turbulence. Not even during an emergency landing last year. This was different. This was personal. And she couldn't undo it. I just didn't know who she was, she whispered, barely audible. Brooke, who stood near the galley cart, finally spoke. So if she wasn't someone important, it would have been okay? Cassandra looked up. That's not what I meant. But that's what you did, Brooke said. You treated her like a problem, like she didn't matter. Cassandra wanted to scream, to argue, to say that wasn't true. But all she could remember was the way she'd leaned in and raised her voice, the way she said, maybe you're not used to first class, the way she let the cup fall and pretended it was nothing. She blinked hard and rubbed her face. In the cockpit, the captain received another call. Ground team again, the voice said. Walker's office confirmed. His legal advisor will meet him at the gate. A rep from the airline board will also be waiting. The captain sighed. Noted. Back in seat 1A, Margaret turned her head slightly toward her son. You always said I needed to speak up more, she said softly, a faint smile playing at the corner of her mouth. He looked at her, surprised she was joking. She added, Now I see where you get that cold stare from. Brandon smiled slightly, but it didn't last. People saw it, Mom. No one said a word. Not until after. I noticed, she said. But that's how it's always been. People see things they don't want to get involved in. And those who do speak up, they pay a price. Not this time, he said. Margaret nodded slowly. Just don't let anger lead the way. It's not anger, he replied. It's responsibility. And with that, he picked up his phone again. If the airline thought it could fix this with a quiet apology or a private voucher, they were about to be very wrong. The plane continued its smooth glide through the clouds, but inside the cabin, turbulence was already underway, emotional, silent, and spreading row by row. Passengers in first class were no longer pretending to ignore what had happened. They weren't speaking much, but their expressions gave them away. Nervous glances, tight jaws, furrowed brows. A few were quietly texting on their phones, probably telling friends or family about the man in 1B and the drama unfolding mid-air. Some simply stared straight ahead, pretending to be focused on the safety card or the movie screen. But their minds were still on the elderly woman who sat calmly with soaked fabric clinging to her blouse. Margaret had stopped drying her shirt. She knew it was useless now. She could feel the damp chill across her stomach, but she didn't complain. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. She had lived long enough to understand the difference. Years of being talked over, dismissed, and underestimated had taught her that not every insult needed a reply. Some people expected her to react, to make a scene, to fight back so they could blame her for causing trouble. But Margaret didn't give them that. She never had. Brandon knew that about her. It used to frustrate him when he was younger, watching his mother stay quiet in the face of disrespect while he burned with rage on the inside. But now he saw her silence for what it truly was. Power. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. And still, Her presence made everyone feel the weight of what they had just witnessed. The same couldn't be said for Cassandra. Still hidden in the galley, she stared at the back wall, her mind running in circles. Her body was there, but her thoughts were somewhere else, somewhere far from the flight. She replayed the scene in her head again and again. Her tone, her words, the way she flicked the cup. It had all happened so fast, too fast to take back. And now, there was no escape, no control. Not even her seniority on the crew could protect her from what was waiting on the ground. Brooke moved quietly in the background, preparing the final beverage service. She didn't speak to Cassandra again, but her silence said everything. It was the kind of silence that made you feel watched even when no one was looking. The kind that made you question not just what you'd done, but who you were when you did it. Cassandra suddenly stood and whispered, "I should go back out there. I should say something." Brooke didn't turn around. "He doesn't want to hear from you, and she definitely doesn't. I could still apologize." "It's not about the apology anymore," Brooke replied flatly. "You made it personal." Cassandra sat back down slowly, as if the weight of that sentence alone pushed her into the chair. Meanwhile, in seat 1B, Brandon checked his phone again. Multiple notifications had come in already. His legal team had responded. His media manager had flagged the situation. Even his board chairman had sent a short message. "Do you want us to intervene?" He didn't reply yet. He didn't need to. Everyone was already preparing for the storm. What Cassandra didn't know, and what the airline had clearly forgotten, was that Brandon didn't just fund a few systems for this airline. He had built them. The payment processing platform, the real-time ticketing engine, the upgraded app that customers use to select seats and check in. His companies had created them all, without his name attached, of course. He preferred it that way. But now his silence was no longer protecting anyone. He turned to his mother and asked quietly, "You feeling okay?" She gave a small nod. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just tired." Brandon hesitated before saying, "We'll be landing soon. After that, I want you to go straight to the lounge. They're sending a car." Margaret turned to him, eyes searching his face. "Are you sure this is necessary?" He didn't flinch. "You didn't ask for this, Mom, but it happened, and they need to learn." Margaret sighed, the kind of sigh that carried years behind it. What if she loses her job? Brandon looked ahead. His voice was calm but final. Then maybe next time she'll think before treating someone like that. A few rows behind them, the captain's voice came on over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions." The usual announcements felt strange now. Normal words sitting on top of an abnormal situation. People adjusted their seats in silence, but their eyes kept flicking toward the front of the cabin. The curtain to the galley remained closed, and behind it, Cassandra sat frozen, waiting for the ground to come closer and bring the consequences with it. The plane tilted gently downward, beginning its slow descent toward the city below. Outside the windows, clouds drifted past like soft curtains, but inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had hardened. In first class, the seats were still, the passengers unusually quiet, as if everyone understood that something irreversible had already taken place. The woman in seat 1A was no longer just another traveler. She had become the center of something much larger, something raw and uncomfortable that no one could unsee or ignore. Margaret kept her eyes on the window, but she wasn't watching the view. Her reflection stared back at her faintly in the glass. Tired eyes, tight lips, the remains of cold water drying on her blouse. She knew Brandon was watching her from the side, and she knew he was angry. But it wasn't the kind of anger that exploded. It was the kind that calculated, the kind that waited, the kind that didn't shout but changed everything quietly from behind the curtain. And somewhere behind that curtain, Cassandra was unraveling. She sat alone now, her elbows on her knees, eyes wide, chest tight. Every sound from the intercom made her jump. The pressure in the cabin was nothing compared to the pressure in her own mind. Her hands still smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and cheap lotion, and she hated it. That smell used to mean she was ready to greet passengers with a smile, to take control of the flight, to look sharp and efficient and important. Now it just reminded her of how fast everything could fall apart. No one had spoken to her since the call from the cockpit. Brooke hadn't returned. The other attendants had chosen to keep their distance, not out of cruelty, but out of quiet understanding. They knew what was happening. They knew Cassandra was done. She had been the senior on this flight, the one who trained others, the one who lectured younger crew members about professionalism and standards. And now, she was the one hiding in the back, afraid to face a woman she had dismissed with a smirk and a slap of a cup. Her name was probably already in the incident report. Security would be waiting at the gate, and she didn't know if they would walk her out gently or escort her through the terminal in full view of the public. She could already hear the conversations that would follow, other crew members whispering her name at training sessions, in lounges, at coffee breaks. "Did you hear what Cassandra did? She lost it on a passenger. Yeah, the woman's son is some billionaire. Whole airline's on fire because of it." Cassandra ran her hands through her hair, the tight bun falling apart. She had always been so careful, so polished. She had kept a clean record for years. But none of that mattered now. One moment, one terrible, thoughtless moment, and everything she'd built was slipping away. Meanwhile, in seat 1B, Brandon reached for his phone one more time. The screen glowed in the dimmed cabin lights, filled with unread messages from his staff, legal team, and board members. He opened a text from his executive assistant. "Media outlets are starting to notice your flight activity. We recommend preparing a statement. Do you want to take the lead, or should we handle it from PR?" He typed a short reply. "No press yet. Let them speak first, then we answer." He didn't want to look like he was pushing for revenge. That wasn't what this was about. This wasn't about ruining someone's career out of pride. It was about something deeper, something that had happened too many times, to people who didn't have a voice, who didn't have the kind of power his name carried. His mother had simply asked for water, and for that she had been insulted, dismissed, and humiliated in front of a full cabin. He thought about how many others had experienced the same, without anyone ever standing up for them. No phone call to corporate, no legal team waiting on the ground, just silence, shame, and the long walk down the aisle with people staring and doing nothing. Not this time. Brandon looked ahead as the landing gear thudded softly beneath them. The cabin lights flickered as the plane dipped lower, city lights now glowing in the distance. He leaned slightly toward Margaret and whispered, "Once we land, don't talk to anyone. Just follow the officer at the door, he's with us." Margaret gave a small nod. She didn't ask questions. She never did when Brandon took that tone. She trusted him, always had. But a part of her still hoped this could be solved quietly, that maybe it wouldn't have to go where it was headed. But she also knew her son. Once he made a decision, he followed it through. The plane touched down with a soft rumble, the tires hugging the runway as the engines roared and slowed. A hush settled over the cabin, deeper than before. There was no applause, no casual conversations, only the mechanical whine of the flaps lowering and the soft ding of the seatbelt sign still glowing above them. The captain's voice came on again, steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. Ground personnel will be boarding briefly to assist with a matter concerning the crew. We appreciate your cooperation." The words were careful, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The plane rolled steadily across the runway, the slow drag of wheels against asphalt echoing beneath the quiet cabin. Outside the windows, the lights of the airport glowed like small orbs in the darkness. Inside, the silence felt heavier now, as if the passengers knew that whatever was about to happen wasn't just standard procedure. The usual rush of energy that came with landing, the seatbelts clicking, passengers stretching, phones being powered on, was absent. Everyone stayed still, watching, waiting. Margaret sat upright, hands still on her purse, her face calm but unreadable. She could sense the tension in her son's body, even though he hadn't spoken since they began descending. Brandon hadn't moved except to glance at his phone once more. His fingers tapped the screen quickly, then paused. He read the message that had just arrived, his jaw tightening as he stared at the words. Gate security is in place. Airline rep is confirmed on site. Internal Affairs requested direct escort of involved crew member. Discretion advised. Terminal cameras are active. Brandon didn't reply. He just locked his phone and slid it into his coat pocket. His silence said more than any statement ever could. From the front of the aircraft, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the lights brightened slightly. The usual sounds began. A few belts clicking, carry-on bags shifting, and some passengers standing to stretch. But most people remained seated. They were watching the front, waiting for something. They didn't have to wait long. The cabin door opened with a soft hiss, and a uniformed man stepped into the first-class area. He wore a dark suit and an airport security badge clipped to his chest. Behind him stood a woman in a navy blazer, holding a tablet and a leather folder. She looked around, nodded politely to the captain, and stepped forward. "Good afternoon," she said softly, addressing only the crew at the front. "We're here to speak with one of your flight attendants, Cassandra Reed." The words moved through the air like a shockwave. Cassandra, still seated in the rear galley, heard her name and froze. Her heart jumped into her throat. She stood slowly, adjusting her jacket and brushing her hands down her uniform, trying to make herself look composed. But her legs felt weak. Her throat was dry. She could barely hear her own footsteps over the pounding in her ears as she made her way down the aisle. The passengers didn't hide their interest now. Some leaned into the aisle, others stared straight at her. She kept her eyes forward, trying to avoid Brandon's gaze as she passed. But she couldn't ignore it. His eyes were locked on her, cold, steady, unreadable. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. When Cassandra reached the front, the woman with the folder stepped aside and gestured to the aisle. "Please come with us." Cassandra nodded stiffly. "Of course." She turned slightly toward the captain as if looking for reassurance, but none came. He merely gave her a small nod and turned back toward the cockpit. The moment Cassandra stepped out of the aircraft, the door hissed shut behind her. Gasps and whispers rippled through the cabin. Some passengers looked shocked. Others just shook their heads in disbelief. But Brandon remained still, his face hard, unmoving. Beside him, Margaret shifted slightly in her seat. "She looked scared," she said quietly. Brandon gave a short breath through his nose. "She should be." Margaret didn't respond. She wasn't used to watching people fall like that. She had been on the receiving end too many times. But she wasn't going to defend Cassandra either. Not after what happened. Still, watching someone walk off a plane like that, in silence and shame, left a strange ache in her chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something else. Something she didn't have words for. Back on the jet bridge, Cassandra walked stiffly between the two officials. She kept her head low, eyes on the floor, afraid to look left or right. The hallway was quiet, but she could feel the presence of people. Workers peeking from open doors, ground staff pretending to check equipment while sneaking glances. Her face burned with shame. At the end of the jet bridge, they led her through an unmarked door that took her into a back hallway, out of view of the regular passengers. It smelled like coffee and cleaning fluid. The walls were white and bare. The woman with the folder finally spoke. "You'll be asked to give a full written statement. Your employee ID has been temporarily locked. Until further notice, you are not to board another aircraft under this airline's name." Cassandra didn't argue. She didn't protest. She just nodded slowly, her hands gripping the strap of her small crew bag until her knuckles turned white. Behind her, the cabin door opened once more. This time, it was for Margaret and Brandon. They stood together as Brooke approached. "Sir," she said to Brandon, "a vehicle is waiting at the gate for you and your mother. The lounge has been cleared." Brandon nodded once. "Thank you." He helped Margaret with her bag, even though she insisted she could carry it herself. They walked through the first-class cabin in silence. Some passengers offered small nods of acknowledgement. A few looked away. Others lowered their eyes, too ashamed to meet hers. Margaret didn't react. She just walked with quiet dignity, like nothing about her had changed. And in truth, it hadn't. The only thing that had changed was how everyone saw her now, and how they would never forget her again. As Margaret and Brandon stepped off the aircraft, a gust of cool air swept through the jet bridge. The noise of the airport beyond buzzed faintly. Beeping carts, rolling suitcases, muffled announcements. But inside this narrow space, it felt distant, almost like the outside world had paused to make room for the quiet tension that followed them. A tall man in a tailored black suit waited near the end of the bridge. He wore a small pin on his lapel, the unmistakable emblem of the airline's executive board. Beside him stood another man, younger, holding a digital tablet and wearing a headset. Both of them straightened the moment Brandon came into view. "Mr. Walker," the older man said with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, "welcome home. We deeply regret the incident that occurred on this flight. Please accept our full apology on behalf of the airline." Brandon stopped walking but said nothing. The man continued quickly. "We've already begun a formal review. Cassandra Reed has been suspended pending investigation. We're taking this matter very seriously. If there's anything you or your mother need, not here," Brandon said firmly, his voice low and direct. "We'll speak in a private room." "Of course, sir, right this way." They were led through a set of frosted glass doors that opened into a quiet corridor. No foot traffic, no onlookers, just silence and polished floors. The walls were lined with soft lighting and framed photographs of smiling flight attendants, gleaming aircraft, and cheerful slogans that now felt hollow. At the end of the hallway was a door marked Executive Lounge, Private. Inside was a quiet room with soft leather chairs, a mahogany conference table, and a spread of untouched refreshments. Margaret sat down gently near the window. Brandon remained standing. The executive from the board took the seat across the table, opened his folder and placed it down without looking up. "We've already collected statements from the flight crew. The captain filed his initial report in flight. We also have access to the cabin camera footage." Brandon crossed his arms. And, the man hesitated. "It matches what was described." Ms. Reed's behavior was unacceptable. She made assumptions. She disrespected a passenger. She ignored the boarding list. And she assaulted a customer. The word hung in the air like a heavy curtain no one wanted to touch. Margaret didn't flinch. She simply folded her hands in her lap. "We've issued her an immediate suspension and opened a disciplinary hearing," the man continued. "She'll have an opportunity to respond. We don't believe in overreacting, but we are prepared to follow protocol." Brandon narrowed his eyes. "Protocol? Yes, there's a process for this." "Let me tell you something about process," Brandon said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, but his words were sharp. "Process didn't stop her from mocking my mother. Process didn't stop her from raising her voice, insulting her in front of a cabin full of people, and slapping a drink out of her hand like she was a child. Protocol didn't stop the silence from every passenger and every crew member who stood there and said nothing. The only reason anything's being done now is because of my name. If this had been someone else's mother, someone without that name, you and I both know there wouldn't even be a meeting." The executive's face tightened, but he didn't argue. Margaret looked up and spoke softly. "He's not wrong." The man shifted in his seat. "We understand the weight of this, ma'am, truly, and we are committed to making things right." Brandon leaned forward slightly. "Then you'll listen carefully. This isn't about a single employee. It's about a culture, one that lets someone like Cassandra smile at every man in a suit, offer drinks to every diamond bracelet in the room, and then turn her nose up at someone who doesn't look like they belong." The younger assistant with the headset typed silently beside him, eyes on the tablet. "I'm not interested in apologies. Brandon continued. I want action. I want written confirmation that bias training will be implemented immediately. I want real passenger complaint tracking reviewed by independent consultants. And I want a formal report sent to every shareholder detailing this incident and the steps you're taking to address it. The room fell quiet. The executive hesitated. That's a very public path. Exactly. Mr. Walker, he said slowly, we understand your position, and your mother absolutely deserves respect. But if we go public with something like this, I'll do it myself, Brandon said, cutting him off. The man blinked. I beg your pardon. Brandon reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again. He held up the screen, which displayed a drafted statement ready to be sent to the press. His media firm was already standing by. A single button would start a wave the airline would not be able to contain. You think I want this? He asked. I don't. I'd prefer this be handled internally, quietly, with accountability. But if you hesitate, if you try to protect her, or protect your brand more than my mother's dignity, then we'll handle it the other way. The executive sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. You'll have what you're asking for, every point, in writing, within 48 hours. Brandon gave a single nod. Then we're done here. He walked toward the door but paused when he saw Margaret hadn't moved. She was still seated, gazing out the window. He turned back. Mom? She turned to him with a soft smile. I'm coming, baby. Just needed a moment to breathe. The executive stood, placing his hand gently on the table. Ma'am, if there's anything else we can do... Margaret looked at him. Her voice was steady, clear. Just make sure the next woman who looks like me doesn't have to live through what I did today. Then she stood, adjusted her purse on her shoulder, and walked out with her son. No anger, no raised voice, just dignity and power. The automatic doors of the executive lounge slid open with a quiet hiss as Margaret and Brandon stepped back into the main terminal. The noise of the airport returned all at once, footsteps echoing against the tiled floors, rolling suitcases clattering, the robotic voice of overhead announcements calling out flight numbers. But around the gate where they had just arrived, a quiet hush lingered. People still stood nearby, uncertain if it was appropriate to speak or look, as if they had just witnessed something too real to treat as casual. Security escorted them discreetly through a side hallway, bypassing the crowds, flashing a special clearance badge that allowed them through a private corridor. The hallway was quiet, lined with clean white walls, dim lighting, and the faint scent of floor polish. No flashing cameras, no gawking strangers, just silence, and the echo of shoes against the smooth floor. Brandon walked ahead, checking his phone as he moved. More messages had come in. His legal counsel had already sent over a draft of the airline's signed acknowledgement letter. The board had agreed, reluctantly but firmly, to issue an internal investigation notice to their crew department. Bias training would become mandatory. Public disclosure was optional, pending Brandon's next move. He stopped walking for a moment, glancing back at his mother. Margaret had paused near a window that overlooked the runway. She stood there quietly, watching a plane in the distance rise into the pale afternoon sky. She didn't say anything. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the glass. Her shoulders relaxed. You okay? Brandon asked gently as he stepped beside her. Margaret nodded slowly. I'm just thinking, she replied. About what? She gave a faint smile. About how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. Brandon didn't speak. He looked out at the sky with her, both of them quiet for a long moment. Finally she continued, her voice soft but steady. You know, years ago, I sat in a waiting room while a nurse asked every other person if they needed help. She walked past me 3 times. Never made eye contact. I sat there for almost 40 minutes. And when your father asked what I did about it, I told him nothing. I said, it wasn't worth the trouble. She turned to look at Brandon. But today was worth it. Brandon nodded, his throat tightening slightly. You spoke up, she added. And this time, People listened. He looked at her, his voice low. I couldn't stay quiet, Mom. Not after everything you've carried. Not when the world still thinks people like you don't belong in certain seats. A soft knock interrupted their moment. A man in a dark uniform approached carefully. He wore a badge that read, Operations Supervisor. Mr. Walker, he said politely, your car is ready. It's waiting outside through the private exit. Brandon nodded once. The man glanced at Margaret with a respectful smile. It's an honor to meet you, ma'am. Margaret smiled faintly. Thank you, young man. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, flanked by security and the operations supervisor. A black SUV waited at the curb, engine running, windows tinted. The driver opened the door for Margaret first. She stepped in slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd just beyond the rope barrier nearby. Some travelers looked over curiously. A few recognized Brandon. One or two raised their phones, pretending to check notifications while subtly snapping photos. But he didn't acknowledge them. He helped his mother into the vehicle, closed the door gently, and walked around to his side. Before stepping in, he paused. Across the parking loop, through the glass walls of the terminal, he saw a familiar face being led through a staff hallway. Cassandra. Her uniform jacket was half unbuttoned, her hair pulled back in a hurry. She was flanked by 2 HR officers, her face pale, eyes fixed forward. She didn't see him, and he didn't wave. Brandon watched her disappear through another door before climbing into the SUV beside his mother. Inside, the driver asked, Destination, sir? Brandon gave the name of their private residence, then leaned back in the seat. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded over her lap again, a tired but peaceful expression on her face. Neither of them spoke during the ride. They didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and so had the change. Quiet, powerful, permanent. The SUV glided along the highway, the city skyline growing smaller in the rearview mirror. Inside the car, silence settled like a blanket. Not awkward or tense, just full. Full of thoughts unspoken, memories swirling, emotions unprocessed. Margaret leaned back in her seat, her eyes scanning the landscape through the tinted glass. She didn't look tired anymore. She looked still, like someone who had reached a quiet truth. Brandon sat beside her, phone resting face down on the console between them. He hadn't touched it in 20 minutes. For a man whose world revolved around speed, control, and constant decisions, this was rare. But today wasn't like most days. Today had stripped something raw, not just anger, not just pride, something deeper, something tied to years of watching people like his mother treated like furniture, present but unnoticed, silent but dismissed. He glanced at her and noticed a faint smile on her lips. It surprised him. You're smiling? He asked gently. Margaret didn't turn. I'm thinking, she said. About what? About how that girl, Cassandra, looked when they walked her past the gate. Brandon frowned. You feel sorry for her? Margaret took her time before answering. Not exactly. I don't excuse what she did. Not for 1 second, but I also know shame when I see it. That wasn't just fear in her eyes. It was understanding. Maybe not enough, but some. Brandon looked away, his jaw tight. She didn't care who you were. She just decided you didn't belong, and she didn't whisper it. She humiliated you like you were invisible. Margaret nodded slowly. She saw a woman who didn't fit the picture of first class, a seat she didn't think I deserved. That's her fault. That's on her, but now, she knows better. Brandon didn't answer. He didn't want to let go of the rage just yet. Margaret finally turned her head toward him. You did what I never would have, she said. You held her accountable. You stood up for me. I'll never forget that. Brandon softened. You shouldn't have needed me to. You should have been treated with dignity. Period. And I should have spoken louder, Margaret added. I've had years to find my voice. Maybe it took you doing it for me to finally use it. He looked over. You didn't need to speak louder. You just needed people to listen better. Margaret smiled again. That too. They rode in silence for a few more minutes, the road stretching ahead like a ribbon of stillness. Margaret closed her eyes and leaned her head back. "You think she'll ever get her job back?" she asked. Brandon didn't hesitate. "I don't know. That's not up to me." Margaret opened her eyes. "Would you stop her if you could?" He turned the question over in his mind. He could have. With one email, he could have blacklisted her from every major airline. His company had that much pull. But power didn't mean righteousness, and revenge wasn't the same thing as justice. "If she learns from it," he said quietly, "and if she changes, then maybe she deserves a second chance. But that's not my job to decide. My job was to make sure she understood the weight of what she did." Margaret nodded, satisfied with that answer. "Then you've done enough." The SUV turned off the freeway and merged onto a quiet road lined with trees. The late afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting soft shadows over the sidewalk. Brandon's home stood just beyond the gates, modern, clean, quiet. The car slowed as the gates opened. As they approached the driveway, Margaret turned to him one last time. "You know," she said softly, "what happened today won't stay on that plane." Brandon raised an eyebrow. "You mean the media?" "No," she replied. "I mean the passengers, the people who watched, the ones who said nothing, the ones who looked away. They'll remember. Not just what she did, but how you responded, how you made them all feel something they didn't expect to feel." Brandon leaned his head against the window, watching the gates close behind them. "I hope they do," he said, because that was the only thing more powerful than money or lawsuits or suspension notices. Memory. And now, that memory belonged to every person on that plane. A moment that started with silence and ended with a message no one would forget. Evening had started to slip across the sky by the time Brandon helped Margaret out of the SUV. The driveway was smooth beneath their feet, surrounded by soft lighting and the neatly trimmed hedges that bordered the estate. The house stood quietly in front of them, modern, glass-walled, designed for comfort and privacy. Yet that evening, it felt less like a home and more like a resting place after battle. A housekeeper opened the front door before they reached it, offering a warm smile. "Welcome home, Mr. Walker. Mrs. Walker, it's good to see you." Margaret returned the smile with her usual grace. "Thank you, Nora. It's good to be here." As they entered, the smell of fresh citrus cleaner and faint vanilla filled the air. The space was calm, soft light reflecting off the marble floors. Everything in the home was quiet, intentional. Brandon had always built his spaces like that, controlled, composed, untouchable. But after the storm of the last few hours, even he felt how heavy silence could become. Margaret walked toward the sitting room, slowly lowering herself onto the cream-colored sofa. She sank into the cushions with a soft sigh, her body finally relaxing. Brandon disappeared briefly into the kitchen, returning with a cup of hot tea which he placed gently in front of her. She looked up and smiled with gratitude. He sat across from her, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. "I still can't believe it happened," he said, almost to himself. Margaret took a slow sip of her tea. "I can." Brandon looked up. "You're not even surprised?" "No," she said, placing the cup down. "That's the thing, Brandon. This isn't new. It's not rare. You just saw it today." He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I knew people like Cassandra existed. I just didn't expect her to be so bold, so casual." Margaret's eyes softened. "That's because you've built a world where people don't treat you that way anymore. You forgot how the rest of us live when we don't carry your last name." The truth of her words settled in the room. "She didn't even see me," Margaret continued, more to herself now. "She looked right through me, like I wasn't worthy of service, like I had wandered into a space that wasn't meant for people like me." Brandon's face tightened. "That's what makes me furious. You raised me to believe I belonged in any room, and she tried to make you feel like you didn't belong in a seat you paid for." Margaret gave a slow, thoughtful nod. I used to believe I had to stay silent to keep peace. Keep my head down, stay polite, smile through the worst of it. I thought that was strength. She paused, her voice low. But today I learned something new. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else raise their voice for you. Brandon looked at her, heart heavy. I wish I had done it sooner. For all the times I didn't see it, or didn't want to see it. You were a boy back then, she said. Now you're a man, one who stood up not just for me, but for every quiet person who's ever been treated like air. They sat in stillness for a while. Then Margaret spoke again. She'll remember this, Brandon, that flight attendant. She'll carry this for the rest of her life. Brandon raised an eyebrow. Do you want me to give her a second chance? Margaret considered the question carefully. I don't want her punished for the sake of punishment, she said. But I do want her changed. And sometimes the only way people change is when the world stops forgiving their comfort. Brandon leaned back, exhaling slowly. I can live with that. Margaret's eyes moved to the window. The sky had darkened now, the last bit of sunlight fading behind the trees. The day had ended, but its echo would last. She looked at her son, the boy she had raised with quiet hands and loud hope. You've built empires, Brandon, but today, you built something better. He blinked. What do you mean? You built a standard, she said. You told the world what you will and will not allow when it comes to how people are treated. And more importantly, you told them it's not just about power, it's about principle. Brandon didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, humbled. From somewhere in the house, a gentle chime rang, a new message. He picked up his phone and read it silently. Cassandra Reed has submitted a written apology. Do you want to review it? He stared at the message for a long moment. Then he placed the phone face down on the table and looked at his mother. Not tonight, he said quietly. Margaret smiled. Good. Let her sit with it a while. And with that, they sat together in quiet agreement. No press, no screens, no rush to respond. Some lessons didn't need to be spoken, they needed to be felt. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows of the living room, casting long shadows on the floor. The house, still and hushed, felt entirely different in the light of day. Brandon stood in the kitchen, watching the coffee drip into a porcelain mug, steam rising slowly, curling in the air. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts had been too active, turning, sorting, weighing everything that had happened. In the other room, Margaret had already woken. She sat by the window wrapped in a light shawl, a book open in her lap but unread. Her eyes drifted now and then to the garden outside, where early light sparkled on the dew-covered leaves. The calm around her felt earned. The storm had passed, but the message it left behind still lingered in the walls. Brandon walked over and placed a second cup of tea beside her. She looked up with that same soft smile she always gave him, the kind that never asked for anything, never demanded thanks, just gave warmth freely. He took the seat across from her. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence wasn't empty. It was the kind of quiet that held weight, a peaceful aftertaste of something long overdue. Finally, Brandon broke the silence. I read the apology. Margaret looked up, her expression neutral. And? He took a breath. It wasn't defensive. She didn't try to explain it away. She admitted she judged you. Said it wasn't the first time she's made assumptions. Said it was the first time someone made her see herself the way others might have seen her. Margaret took a slow sip of tea. Did it sound honest? Yes, Brandon said, nodding. It did. She looked at him thoughtfully. So, what now? He leaned back in the chair, looking toward the ceiling as if the answer might be written there. I don't know. I don't want to ruin someone. I never did. I wanted to make a point. I wanted her to feel what you felt, even if only for a moment. I think she has. Margaret nodded slowly, then turned back to the window. Sometimes the greatest punishment is having to live with what you've done, and knowing you can't undo it. But if she's really willing to change, then maybe that moment on the plane didn't happen for nothing. Brandon rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. You'd forgive her? Margaret didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person, she finally said. Sometimes it's for us. To stop carrying the weight of what someone else did. I don't want to wake up tomorrow still feeling like that woman saw me as less. I'd rather wake up knowing she'll never make someone else feel that way again. Brandon nodded slowly, letting her words settle in. His phone buzzed again on the table. Another message. This one from the airline's CEO. We're implementing every measure you requested. Staff retraining starts Monday. We'd also like to schedule a meeting to hear your feedback directly, if you're willing. He read the message silently, then turned the phone over and set it aside. That's something, he said. They're moving, not just covering their image. Real changes, Margaret gave a short nod. Good, but don't let them turn it into a photo op. Brandon chuckled under his breath. You really think I'd let that happen? Margaret smiled but didn't answer. The morning sun grew warmer, casting golden rays on the floor. Brandon stood and walked toward the bookshelf, pulling out an old photo album. He brought it to the coffee table and opened it. Inside were photos from years ago, images of Margaret holding him as a child, of her dressed in hospital scrubs, tired but smiling after long shifts. Pictures of them on buses, in crowded rooms, on second-hand couches. There was nothing glamorous in those pages, just a quiet life, built with love and strength and sacrifice. He flipped to a photo of her from decades ago, standing outside their first apartment, a bag of groceries in one arm, a determined smile on her face. Brandon touched the corner of the photo gently. She would have seen this version of you and still wouldn't have given you water. Margaret chuckled quietly. Probably not. But you didn't change, he said. You've always been the same woman. They just needed someone powerful to remind them who you are. Margaret closed the book softly and looked at her son. And you reminded them, she said. Not with shouting, not with threats, but with truth. Brandon didn't respond. He didn't need to. He stood and offered her his hand. Come on, he said, let's go outside. The garden's peaceful this time of morning. Margaret took his hand and rose slowly, steady on her feet. They walked through the sliding glass doors and into the sun-warmed air. The birds chirped softly, and the scent of blooming jasmine floated around them. And as they walked together along the stone path side by side, Brandon knew something had shifted. Not just in that airline, not just on that plane, but in the space between people who had watched that moment unfold. There was no viral headline, no cameras, no trending hashtag, just a simple truth that had finally landed where it needed to. Everyone deserves to be seen. Everyone deserves to be heard. And some moments, no matter how quiet, echo forever. Later that afternoon, the sky softened into a pale blue, brushed with streaks of gold and orange as the sun began its slow descent. Brandon sat alone on the back patio, a cup of untouched coffee resting on the small table beside him. The garden, calm and full of color, buzzed with life. Birds chirping in distant trees, a breeze shifting the leaves, the gentle trickle of water from the stone fountain nearby. It was the kind of peace he rarely allowed himself to enjoy. But today, after everything, it felt necessary. He stared ahead, not at anything in particular, just allowing himself the quiet. No meetings, no strategy, no headlines to manage. The weight that had pressed down on him for years, the pressure to always control, fix, build, had lightened, if only a little. Inside the house, Margaret stood by the kitchen window, watching her son from a distance. She didn't want to interrupt. She had seen him carry the world on his shoulders for too long, calm on the outside, always moving, always building. But today he had carried something different. He had carried her, and he had done it without asking for credit, without using his name as a shield, without reducing her pain to a headline. He had simply stood up, not just as a son, but as a man who knew right from wrong, who understood the quiet pain of watching someone you love be treated as less. She stepped outside and joined him on the patio. Brandon looked up and smiled. A real smile this time, tired but honest. "You okay?" she asked. "I think so," he said softly. She sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap. They sat in silence, letting the wind fill the spaces between their thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "Do you think people will remember what happened?" Brandon nodded. "I think some will." "And the ones who won't?" she asked. He looked at her. "They'll remember the feeling. Maybe not the names or the details, but something inside them will change. That's all it takes sometimes." Margaret leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly as the wind passed through her silver hair. "You've always been strong," she said. Brandon smiled faintly. "I get it from you." They sat that way until the sun slipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. There was no grand moment, no music, no applause, just two people, mother and son, sitting in the aftermath of something deeply human. What happened on that plain didn't just expose someone's cruelty. It revealed the strength of quiet dignity, the power of a son's voice, and the cost of silence from those who knew better. In the end, justice didn't arrive in the form of revenge. It arrived in the form of change. And change, once it begins, does not ask permission. It just keeps moving forward. If this story touched you, make sure to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one.